Annenberg Research Seminar for the year. We will reconvene in January, because this is the end of the semester and the end of the year. And it's a great pleasure to introduce one of our own, Bob Scheer. By way of a personal introduction, I should say that I have been a reader of, a fan of Bob Scheer since long before I knew about the field of communications. Because I started following Bob's work in the 60s when he was editing Ramparts magazine, a publication that has been beautifully described in a book written about it, published last year, as the magazine with a bomb in every issue. You couldn't get it on a plane today, so wouldn't try getting it past the TSA. Bob has a number of really very relevant distinctions for what I'm asking him to talk about today, one of which is a long history in journalism. He was recently analogized in the Los Angeles Times to the journalist in the gadfly tradition of Lincoln Steffens, I.F. Stone, and Seymour Hersh. I think Robert Scheer, reasonable company to be in. He is a practicing journalist and a social analyst and activist, really, who has been teaching here in the area of media and society and ethics of media, but also engaged in the entrepreneurial field of inventing journalism in the digital age, or reinventing journalism in the digital age, something we hear about a lot in this school. And I've asked Bob here today both to talk a little bit about the sort of reinvention of journalism in the digital age as represented by Truthdig, the website that he launched 2 years ago, 5 years ago, that had very rapid success. It has won Webby Awards several years, which are the sort of industry awards within the online journalism field. It also just won awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, which is sort of a nice gesture from the more traditional end of journalism. And to talk a bit about that, within the context, as I said, of many discussions around here about entrepreneurialism and reinventing journalism, but also specifically talking in the context of his latest book, The Great American Stickup, about the role of the media in the current economic crisis that we're all familiar with. Thank you. Wherever you want.
Larry asked me to be a twofer and talk about new media a little bit, and I wanted to talk about my book. So I'll try to do both. And the Truthdig site is really a product of Annenberg. Who's Cheney? John Cheney is one of our top editors. Pasha Anderson is our featured editor. Robert Scheer is a graduate of the program, is our managing editor. So it's Sway Kaufman got her master's over at the Journalism School as our publisher. And I feel this school nurtured it. Jeff Cowan is our advisory board, and Larry Rose. So we run the same emails that you get all the time under Larry's list. He produces more copy than our whole staff combined as an aggregator. Let me just say something about Truthdig. Basically, there's a subject that unites what I want to talk about. It's a little theme. I don't know if there's anybody here from the journalism school. I don't know how I ended up in communications rather than journalism, but my point of view is a bit at odds with some folks. I don't think we ever had the great glory days of media. I think, and I don't think the internet is a threat. I think it's a great opportunity. I don't want to glorify the internet. Obviously, it's got a downside. I know it as well because I'm savage routinely on the internet. And anyone in the world can make up things and so forth. But if there's a unifying idea I have here, it's that the old media was not so great, and they used economic meltdown as a case study. and the new media has great promise. And I put this up here only because this morning I was particularly proud of, every once in a while you figure out, what are you doing here? I'm 74 years old, and what is this all about? And I had a great pleasure as a journalist in publishing Chris Hedges' piece on our site. Actually, we'll show the site. Now, Chris Hedges was one of the great practitioners of old media. He was the New York Times bureau chief in the Middle East for 20 years. He worked for the New York Times, I think, for 20 years. Very distinguished, has won many prizes. His books are well received and so forth. And now Truthdig is his homepage, in part because the New York Times pushed him out after he gave a commencement speech in which he raised some profound questions and that was challenged. We have Bill Boyarsky, who was the political editor of the Los Angeles Times, writes for us. One of the decisions we made in forming Truthdig happened to coincide with when I left the LA Times. I've been there 29 years. And I got the word that a guy named Tom Caswell, actually 2 months later, who had been my copy editor at the LA Times, and I had no idea whether he was a Republican or Democrat. He was a fierce copy editor, and in terms of whether the facts, and it's not logical, and the grammar sucks, and so forth. I lived with this guy for years, actually 13, as my editor, and I heard he was taking a buyout. And I called him up and I said, retirement is not going to be as much fun as you think it is, Tom. And also I need a little extra cash. And you're going to have things to talk about at dinner parties. So why don't I give you the same job you have now at Truthdig? And basically what I meant is, and we've stuck to it, is that he has now 3 or 4 other editors that work with him from their homes on a part-time basis, all LA Times professional editors, and he has the power 24/7 to yank everything. First of all, he's supposed to see everything before it goes on the site, everything. And he has the power to yank, any of them have the power to yank anything off the site, including my own column, which they've done. And they can do it on the basis of libel, a factual error, the headline doesn't match the story, you don't make your point, or so forth. And that was a big decision for us. A lot of writers don't like surrendering that kind of power, but one challenge in doing Truthdig was to say that the internet could adhere to the best standards of traditional journalism. I had grown to respect those standards during my years at the Times. As Larry indicated, I came from alternative journalism with the Ramparts magazine, and then I wrote for Esquire, and Playboy, and a bunch of some other things. But then when I went in 1976 to the Los Angeles Times, I was given a great deal of freedom, but I was also told there were very stern rules of the road about how you conducted your life and your work and so forth, and I grew to respect them. It helped that my wife was also the associate editor and could remind me of these rules of the road even in the evening. And it's funny, it comes up in relation to the banking, I'll mention it later, but one of those little rules was we never accepted freebies. I would go to Rock and Wagner restaurant or Shake and East up in Berkeley, and the owner, who I would know, would send me over a wine or beer. I would have to say, no, I have to have a receipt. I have to sign for it. I would not leave the restaurant without a receipt on my credit card, and so forth, even though $2 one. So we were determined, and so the standards of the LA Times were really quite rigorous as far as conflict of interest, and the way you work, and the honor you had to show the people you were reporting on, the question of integrity. And I really was taken to school. I was kind of a free spirit when I went to the LA Times. I learned a great deal. And so I turned to one of these schoolmasters, Tom Caswell, and we wanted to set a principle for the internet of reliability, of accuracy, and I think it's really paid off. Our traffic is at the highest margin all over the world. You can read us in Shanghai, you can read us in Dublin, and so forth, and people have grown to respect us. We're routinely picked up on sites all over the country, and we've even established on the internet something rare, getting writers paid for syndication. We've forced a lot of sites that carry our work to pay for. Chris Hedges, for instance, this morning, this article appears, it will appear in thousands of sites around the world, but we go after every one of them to get at least $10 or something to establish the principle that writers have to eat. So in addition to having a sense of accuracy and authority in our work, we wanted to pay. That was a biggie, because most of the sites, including Huffington Post, where I appear every Wednesday, and I love Ariana, and I do a radio show with her and all that, but they don't pay in the name. Now Ariana has an investigative unit, and they've got some good people. But in the main, it's thoughts about showering and getting your name in there. And we didn't want that. We pay, we have a deal with AP, we have a deal with the Washington Post, we run Eugene Robinson, we run Dion, we run these people, Lubavitch, we've run people before. We actually have about 4 people in Pulitzers now, after we started running them. But we go through all the channels, we have a deal with AP, we don't use a photograph, we don't use anything on our site that we haven't paid for. And we're trying to pay the writers. We do pay. We started out in a bold effort to pay $1 a word, which was the old Playboy rate that I admired, and that was $2,500 for an article. I did that a number of times. In fact, the dean of the graduate school at Berkeley at the time, Robert Scheer, was the person I turned to for our very first dig, Truthdig, the idea being sort of archaeological reality that means you have to dig for it, before starts and treasure. And I turned to Oracle to write about China. Because I read a piece, I knew Oracle, I'd been in the Center for China Studies with them, and I disagreed with Oracle. It's another principle of ours. We don't have a tight party line, as you find with many on the internet. And he had written a piece about 2 different ways of looking at China, and they were the extreme opposite. One was very rosy, and one was very negative. And I said, we really need a dig, a long piece with taking advantage of hyperlinks and everything. It's a way of exploring how should we think about China. You're a very interesting guy, and while I do think you're entirely too pessimistic about China, we turn to him. And with all of our writers, we have what we call a condominium approach. Once they're hired, once we hook up with them, including this guy here, everybody here knows we can't control it at all. But we have others. Our principle is it's their condominium. They decorate it their way. And as I say, short of their offending Caswell and his libel, fairness, and accuracy, they're going to set the tone. I don't tell PJ Dion or I don't tell Oracle Show what to write, and I certainly don't tell Chris Hedges what to write. And in fact, I had an interesting experience today because one of the documentary filmmakers, Alex Ridley, who I like very much, and who made the smartest guys in the room, the other one awarded his awards now, his movie on Planet 9, The Spitzer. And he's got really great movies. He's my favorite documentary filmmaker. And he wrote me a letter, I just got it this morning, asking me if I would do a Q&A with him because he's out here in Hollywood. And before he could make the request, he had to tell me how upset he was with this Richard Schickel review we had of his documentary on Truthdig. And he said, I assume you haven't read it. Something like that. And I said, no, I have read it. I do disagree with it. But I'm not. Richard Schickel was a long-time film critic, and some people feel the best in the country. I have to think my brother-in-law, Kenny Turan at the LA Times, is the best. But in either case, I wouldn't tell Schickel or Kenny Turan what to write. In fact, Kenny Turan went to review the movie on Nixon that I made. I worked on with Oliver Stone, and he savaged it. Because they was in lockstep next morning. And with Schickel, we were delighted to be able to get him. He appears regularly as one of our critics, as our film critic. And as I say, we don't have a party line. And yes, we're broadly perspective. We're not progressive. We're not going to be homophobic. We're not going to be racist. We're not going to be anti-Semitic, and so forth. But we have to take it occasionally Republicans. But we definitely have to progressive out. Now let me end on it. I don't take up all the time with this. But this is just to show stats on the internet, and we're an eat your vegetable site. We don't have any sex or wild stuff that we know will boost traffic, and we all know what traffic driving is all about. We have experts come to us all the time, and we've actually done a few tests. And we've had some enormous traffic spikes. In fact, we have had to go increasingly to bigger and bigger servers. Because if you get, as we had on some days 3, 4, 5, so we even had 1 million, well, they crash your system, so now we spend a lot of money on our servers. But I just want to show this last week's traffic. And the one that advertisers care about is the blue line, which is uniques. And you can see last Monday, just Chris Hedges, well, we all think we did a very good cartoon, but 59,000 uniques. That means we were visited on 59 separate occasions that Monday. And then the rest day was not my day on Wednesday. Here we had 61,000 on Friday. And then today, we're up to 27,000. I suspect today we'll get up around 60,000 because it's still quite early. We follow traffic. There's a couple. Let me just end this by saying what's the fundamental difference from readers with this, from media and non-media. In a positive sense, you can know what your readers are thinking. They let you know, and they comment all the time, one way or another. And as I say, it's not just on our site, but for instance, my column appears on The Nation. The very next morning appears on Huffington Post, appears on Truthdig, appears on Comedy. Well, Hedges goes to even wider circulation all over the world, and including traditional outlets. It gives me great satisfaction that I'm in the Whittier paper, as Richard Nixon's home paper, and so forth. In that sense, it's very exciting. We can, for instance, if we could click, I'm sure I'm telling you everything you know, but something I do routinely is I look at recent came from, you look at where visitors pass, visitors lens, you look at all of this data, and so you can see, it's 4 in the morning and somebody has just come from Dublin. What are they reading? How long are they going to stay? How many pages do they go on? Because you've got 2, 3, 4 pages. Do they, John, can you just put the front page and keep it up there? And they, how long, do they print it out? Do they send it? So you get a great deal of information. And of course, and if you want to put cookies and do stuff like that, you can learn a great deal more. And you can also, as I say, get response from them. Okay, this is Hedges' piece. Now, we don't have the kind of comment, like on my piece on Huffington Post, I'll have 700 comments, but they're mostly commenting on each other. We tend to restrict our comments, not for content, but this guy Fish, by the way, talking about old media and new media. I think he's the most brilliant political, very. But Fish is a terrific one. He won the Sigma Delta Chi Award this year for best political cartoon, and we're very proud of that because that's an old-fashioned journalism award that come with people like Conrad. You can see the range of our things. We are an advertising site. We do have ads. And now let me just end on that. The big tyranny. So the great thing about the internet is we don't have to chop down trees. We can reach. When I did Ramparts, I was constantly negotiating with the Teamsters, to get our stuff delivered with printers on old bills. The main money thing was not to send writers anywhere. It was to pay off printers and distributors and get stores and so forth. My wife is still very much in this business. She's a book publishing business, so I visited that. In fact, I go for her to Barnes & Noble to make sure she's getting the position in the store that she paid for and stuff like that. We don't have that problem. If we have something good, like we did Kevin Tillman, the brother of Pat Tillman, on the anniversary of his brother's death, and boom, we went viral all over the world without cutting down, without spending an extra penny. Suddenly you had tens of millions of people reading that piece in real time all over the world. As I say, you can also track it and what have you. The tyranny of the internet, for me, the downside is the money. How are you going to pay to send reports? We can have a whole discussion about that. We've sent 3 women to Iraq. We've sent someone to Afghanistan. We have in Nigeria, Vemi, whose name I cannot pronounce, the Obij at Mani, who got her master's here in journalism, communication, sorry. And Vemi is one of the leading reporters in Nigeria. Her husband is the editor of the leading publication. We have a Truthdig bureau that Vemi maintains for us after she got her degree here. And I thought she got 2 degrees. I think she got journalism. Management. Okay. So Vemi is a terrific journalist, and so we have her there. We have people around the world. We pay them. Now, for Nigeria, the money we pay Vemi is real money. It doesn't go as far in Manhattan as it does in there, but we, as I say, we're trying to cover it. The problem is this side, the advertising. And we're in a redesign now to accommodate the advertisers better, but the tyranny of the internet is the texters. When I worked at the LA Times, my wife was the vice president as well as associate editor, and she would tell me about churn. the LA Times would claim, oh, 4 or 5 million eyeballs, people reading this and everything. Well, first of all, what were they reading? Were they reading the sports? Were they reading Dear Abby? Were they reading, this? They certainly weren't reading the opinion section, editorial. But the other thing is, are they really reading it? Now, one thing they would say, there were 4 or 5 to every copy sold. You get these numbers. And then, that's how you get the reading. And then they had this thing called churn, which was at least half of your circulation were people trying not to be part of your circulation. But you kept them going either by not canceling or by giving them cookbooks or prizes or something. The word was churn. And we made sure they didn't drop off the charts in a way that the advertisers would know about it. The other thing is he lied like crazy to the advertisers, and if they saw any blip in sales at their car dealership, you attributed it, of course, to your ad. And you went around it all the time. But the advertisers really did not know, unless some human being brought in the thing or a coupon. We have this tyranny of the click-throughs. We have great ads. I don't even know what ads we have right now, but actually we seem to have only half ads for it. But we have real title. We have all of these. The problem is you can sell any ad you want, but they'll have a click-through. They'll know exactly how many people came and looked at their ad. They'll know how many people bought a car. And this is it's a tyranny. It's good for the advertisers. It's a tyranny for the people who's trying to sell ads. And we are a for-profit, not a not-for-profit. That might have been a mistake, but it can be discussed. But so our income does not equal our outgo. And my publisher and myself, we don't take any money out of this site, and we in fact raise money and publish it. Money, I put in money also. So it's a labor of love, and it's not. And so this is the basic big problem with the new media and the old media. The old media had a business model that worked. The new media has one that doesn't work very well. It depends very much on venture capital, people who are buying a line about how much is going to be made. At Google, it works great for Google. And this was sort of not this book, but my last book is on Google Books, which announced today. Got it hot after my publisher to get this one up there right away. Google makes a bundle. How does Google make a bundle? Because they place ads all over our sites, everybody's site, and they get their take on it. So the internet makes a lot of money, but it makes it for people like Google. And it doesn't make it for most of the news organizations. Even when they say they are making money, they're writing off most of their expenses to their print edition, which then they say is not making much money or not any money at all. But at any rate, the model of the old media worked. Now let me just start my talk by saying very clearly, the kind of press that is guaranteed in the Constitution that our founders had in mind is nothing like the press that existed for most of the history of this country. Let's just be clear about it, okay? The founders had in mind the press that anyone could own, certainly white male, right? We're talking about the town crier, we're talking about the penny press, we're talking about putting a billboard up, even as Norman Lear has pointed out when he's come here and brought the Declaration of Independence, it was printed as a broadsheet and run around by people on horses, right? Places. That was the press. That was guaranteed. Or pamphleteers like Tom Paine. So one of the shocks I had in Street 10 this year that no one in my class had ever heard of Tom Paine. What are you doing here in this school? Anyway, leaving that aside, the notion of the free press that was enshrined in our Constitution disappeared in the 19th century. And the model was always a flawed model, although it worked in terms of profit. It was an advertising-driven model and a for-profit model. And the only quirky part of it is if you had very rich families, like the Salzburg Oaks, the New York Times, the Grahams, the Chandlers, major newspapers, the McCormick's and so forth, and if they were privately owned, then they could take some hits like World War II. The LA Times took a big hit on advertising. If they kept up the quality, they emerged from the war as the main paper in this town. The others went by the wayside. So you had that mixture of advertising and of family ownership that could pretty much. Most of the other journalism, whether taking up the laundry, whether you're talking about the National Review or the Nation's, the oldest liberal, the oldest conservative, but never make any money. The Nation made three in the 3 years of some profit, but they made mostly off their cruises. I know I've been on 7 Nation cruises. They made it off all sorts of things. They didn't make it in the market. So much of what we have considered independent, good quality journalism in this country was supported by, again, wealthier people, even in the old print model. the advertising, the big media, and then when you get commercial television, it's certainly true. An audience driven by advertising that really was not accountable in the sense of, as we all know, with broadcast journalism, who was really watching, what it's selling, and so forth. Now you have this internet. Now I want to bring it to my topic today. Now I've done my part for you, I can do my part or something. Larry wanted me to be very clear to talk about media, which I do know about, and I'm willing to come back and talk about it. But I want to talk about the failure of old media in relation to bank and meltdown. And just so you don't get so teary-eyed about losing control. Let me just say, my first point is, the reason I call my book The Great American Stickup is I don't think this had to happen. This is not a normal problem of capitalism. It was not a perfect storm. It was not an act of God. It's really heresy to blame it on God. It's not. It involved financial gimmicks that were unknown to not only Adam Smith, but were basically unknown not only to Ronald Reagan, but really unknown to George W. Bush. Cite something on that. The things that were made legal that should have not been made legal, it attested the lobbying power, the role of money, in corrupting all of our institutions, something we don't talk about enough, whether it's the academy or the journalism, politics. Enormous amounts of money were brought to bear to make what I think should have been and was illegal, legal, and the result was we have a crackdown of the economy that is enormous in its consequence. We have the largest number of people in poverty that we've ever had, even as a percentage. We're back at 92 levels before Clinton came in. When Clinton came in, we have 50 million Americans whose homes are, they've either lost their homes or they're underwater, seriously on their mortgages. That's an immense problem. We have an unemployment rate that will not go away. We've inflicted great harm on the rest of the world. We've all know the stories of Greece and Spain and so forth. So, and we've discredited one of the great achievements of American society, which was a reliable banking system. That was presumed to be honest, they knew what they were doing, and so forth. And we've rendered it something that really can't be trusted. So, the point of my book is to make clear that this didn't have to happen. The subtitle is How Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats Enriched Wall Street While Mugging Main Street. Now let me say something about how I came to the story. When I was at the LA Times, I was still a national correspondent when Bill Clinton came in. I interviewed Clinton when he was governor. I interviewed him when he was running. I did the LA Times presidential interviews. So I did all of the candidates and so forth. And I was intrigued by Bill Clinton's triangulation, which he discussed in a 2-hour interview we had in Little Rock, and the whole, he used that word, the whole positioning yourself. And I understood it very well. It's basically liberal Democrat in Arkansas has to do a lot of maneuvering to be successful. And he was already talking about something called welfare reform, Project Success. And this was the first initiative. And I went down, most of my colleagues at the LA Times, we had a huge staff down there in Little Rock. I was so disappointed because I was going from one candidate to another. When I got down there, I said, give me the Clinton file. And the Clinton file was all sex. You know, any woman he never winked at, let alone did something more. We had page and page. I said, yeah, but what about welfare reform? You know, what about this Project Success he's touting? We had nothing. Okay, so now I was really, this is one of the journalistic secrets. You know, we're supposed to be instant experts. I knew quite a bit about welfare because I covered it for the LA Times and I'd written about it for a few years. But I really didn't know anything about Project Success in Arkansas, and I basically bought the bait. I bought it. Okay, and he said two things which he then ended up betraying. He said, one, welfare in order to be reformed has to be kept national, and it can't be a budget saver. It has to spend more money. You have to give 70% of people on welfare children. If you want to really get their mothers to work, you have to do job training, you have to supply child care, you have to have transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can't do it on the cheap, and it has to be national because otherwise they'll have a meanness derby with the states, which is exactly what we have now. The states are even cutting back their offices. We even learned about federal food stamps. You know, Idaho, they just did that last week. Cut back their office so people can't even find it. What they can get from the Fed for free doesn't even cost them the state. So when he came in, he immediately betrayed that. And the welfare reform that passed ended the basic federal poverty program. So I was like getting really suspicious of this guy, although I liked him. I found him enormously charming. And very few journalists will admit that, but I will, that their efforts are very often perverted or by charm. I, to this day, cannot look at Bill Clinton on television without smiling. And I have a bigger problem with Obama, who actually, full disclosure, contributed money to his campaign. And I went, you know, and they charm you, and I went to a White House dinner at the end of Clinton's tenure, you know, because I'd written favorably about, you know, semen on the dress is not a deal breaker, and you know, other things are more important. And for that, I got to be at his table at the White House dinner. Hillary Clinton proclaimed, you know, that I was her favorite columnist in the whole world, and so forth. Now, looking back at the record, however, and I have to be very brief because we're running out of time, I would say that the short story of what I have to say about the economy is that it's the Clinton bubble. Okay, and I know it's interesting noise of people in Parkland and so forth, but this, when I first got interested, I saw it happening. Ronald Reagan, who I also knew, I interviewed him a lot before he was governor. I got along with Reagan. He was a real gentleman. He gave me a lot of time. A very decent fellow. And he certainly did want to repeal the New Deal. He was conflicted about it because his own father had worked for the New Deal, and Reagan's admitted his family would have starved were not for the New Deal regulation. But he basically bought into the idea that things had changed and they had to modernize and get rid of those regulations. And he did it by basically visiting GE. He was a spokesperson. And GE was then an exemplary company, a strong rating and very good benefits. They made very good light bulbs and refrigerators. And you know, we really sort of had the idea their slogan was, two things GM, it was GE, what's good for GE is good for America, progress is our most important product. And Reagan bought it, and had happy workers, happy owners, blah, blah, and so forth. What he didn't realize was that GE was even then changing. And by the time of the meltdown, we had something called GE Capital, just like we have GMAC for auto. And GE Capital was responsible for 2/3 of GE's profits. Okay, and GE Capital was deep in the toilet with subprime, all-made mortgages, and all the financial gimmicks that affected everybody else, Citigroup and Goldman Sachs. But Reagan didn't know that. Reagan couldn't pull off his radical deregulation because he had the savings and loan crisis. And the savings and loan crisis alerted the American public to the dangers of radical deregulation. In fact, I don't even call it regulation, I call it fraud prevention. You know, if you lose your house, the marshals are going to come. The government isn't running to be sort of my libertarian lawyers. And the time, you know, you have a good word from the editor of Reason on the back of my book. And I say, really, we're talking fraud. I don't love regulations. I don't want to be told what movies to watch or what to smoke or anything else. I'm not a big advocate of regulation. But it seems to me if the government is going to enforce the contract laws, the government should make sure that they're written clearly and that people can understand it. There isn't fraud involved. The government is going to insure banks, and then you have to have transparency and clarity. And so to my mind, what was changed was really the sensible New Deal regulations that ensured transparency and limits and clarity and what are you insuring or what are you not insuring. And to run out of time, I'm perfectly willing, as part of the economic literacy, to come back, and I'm supposed to be on the committee, so maybe you'll invite me back. But I'm going to, one of the problems again is that what's the good thing about writing a book, people will say it's simplistic or something, and then at least you have the book. And so forth. And so, anyway, two pieces of legislation. When Reagan ended, this is where Krugman and other people were wrong, when they blamed Reagan or they blamed George W. Bush. And you know, yes, the song was sung by Reagan. Yes, Reagan was the poet. Yes, Reagan had Phil Graham and Wendy Graham. Yes, they talked a great deal about getting government off that. There's no question. They set this thing in place. Okay, but it was Clinton who made it a reality. By that time, Phil Graham, who had started as a Democrat, became a Republican. When Clinton came in, he was the most powerful Republican in the banking committee on these matters. Wendy Graham had been head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and so forth. She was now head of the Free Enterprise Center and on the board of Enron. And so, basically, when Reagan at the end ended, he had tightened regulation rather than reducing it in response to savings and loans. And that I do document. He held his nose very tight. So what happened was, then George, the first president, Bush, really didn't care very much. He was off the down policy quite effectively, actually. He wasn't that interested. It remained for Clinton to bring this about. And what he did was, it is interesting how the journalists get their information, but I was going through the Oakland airport, and there was Robert Scheer, spread out like this being wanted. And I said, "Hi, how are you?" And, you know, from about 8 feet, which would have been in Wales, police action. I said, you know, I called you just last week and everything, because, you know, we're looking. He said, yeah, that's real interesting. Bob Hart, brother, and so forth. I said, well, I got this whole thesis I want to run by you. And I hadn't, so we went on. And he basically laid it out. And he has done this thing. He said, yes, you're absolutely right. I told him about my thesis. And by the way, the other person I ran it through who was looking for criticism was Henry Waxman. And he gave me my best blurb on the back, and I was really shocked. Waxman was one of the most influential Democrats, and a great guy. And I ran it all down for him, sat out there and spent a line for 2 hours. And hopefully he read the book, but he didn't read the word. And Reich laid it out. He said, look, when Clinton came in, he got a hold of the top Democrat on Wall Street, which is Robert Scheer. And he said, what do we have to do to get Wall Street on our side? He said, this is not Arkansas. He says, you guys send your kids to the same private schools our kids go to. You know, we know each other. We all support the Harlem Dance Group. We all go to ballet. We're all for choice, you know, and everything. Why do you give all your money to the Republicans? And Rubin said, with his language, you have to get rid of the onerous New Deal regulations. They're out of date. They're crippling us. They're preventing us from being competitive. And this was a line that the media basically swallowed, and I'll get to that in just a second. But he's not leaving the discipline. Rubin talked, and Rubin got him together. Summers was his faculty, and Greenspan. And what do you need? We need to repeal Glass-Steagall, the New Deal legislation that prevents investment banks and commercial banks from merging, and another piece of legislation which I won't discuss. But yes, there really is no reason why we should be angry with Democrats. He took Rubin, who was a honcho at Goldman Sachs, and made him Treasury Secretary. Summers became his deputy, and he made peace with Alan Greenspan. Greenspan kept money light and so forth. So the first payback, and this was not gotten easily, $300 million was spent by the banks lobbying. You know, it's interesting as a journalist, I could go into this in great detail, but there's a certain reality check that I think I believe bring to Annenberg. I'm not the only one. But I like the fact that we have clinical professors, okay, and people still outside working. And I was there at those meetings. And I did economics, you know. I did 3 years at Berkeley graduate school. And I'm not intimidated by economics. And in fact, I was on the mathematical econometric side of it because I studied engineering during most of my undergraduate career. So I was not hostile to any of the stuff that was going on in that way. And I remember sitting in these hearings and reading these things, and then we go to the drafting meeting. And I go up to friendly members of Congress, people I agreed with, you know, and Barney Frank, one of the members, sitting in his office late at night talking about this. I said, what? Do you realize what's in this bill? This bill allows, you know, here Roosevelt had put a wall saying an investment bank is a bank playing with rich people's money who are knowledgeable. Okay, if there's a crime, there's a victimless crime. They knew what they were doing, they gambled, and they took the risk, okay? And then here you have a commercial bank, which thanks to the New Deal and everything, we've made insured and protected and transparent and conservative. Remember, they give loans out there conservative and so forth. They want to make sure the value is in the house, and you know, it's not put into some new fancy security. And they're going to hold it for 30 years, and you're going to have to pay it back, because if you don't pay it back and you don't have the credit and you're not reliable, they're going to be stuck with it for 30 years. They're going to praise it honestly, and all of the things that were swept aside in this mad period, and that's what banking was. Dull, conservative, and commercial banking, investment banking. So what happened was Citigroup, Citicorp, the bank, the official bank, would merge with Travelers Insurance. And Travelers Insurance had a number of investment banks. And they made this merger with the blessings of the administration and Greenspan, and the Fed gave them a temporary exemption. But in order for that merger to stick and not to have to divest the main part, they would have to have the law change. Glass-Steagall would have to be repealed. Okay? And so this was the ball game, and I bring you up to date. Okay, now what happened here was the communications industry, and I was there at these meetings representing the Times Mirror, and you know, some says, and you'd be there, and I'd say to the vice president, to the congressman, what's in it? What's in it? You know, what does this mean? And he'd look at me and I say, oh, go talk to Harold over there. He's on my staff, and he really follows this. And then I'd get a hold of Harold, and Harold said, you know, Bob, I'm really busy, and I'm working on 5 different things now, but Charles over there, he really gets it. I said, but Charles is a lobbyist for the banks. I said, yeah, but you know, it's Charles. And what you learn is lobbyists are no longer like in the old days. They're not fat white guys who belly up to the bar and offer you. You know, we have the Jess Sumner Center. You remember the famous Jess Sumner quote? Right? What is it, Tom?
I'm sorry, what's
The famous Jess Sumner quote about lobbyists?
that money is the mother's milk of politics?
Well, that's a good one. But the other one was, you can't take their money, sleep with their women, and what was the other one? Sleep with their women and drink their booze and vote against them. You don't belong in politics. So well, that's the world that the Jess Sumner Institute is dedicated to. And anyway, and it's true. I was in South Carolina. And they weren't, but they're no longer fat white guys. They're skinny, transvestite, Chinese, anything you want. You want a liberal, you got a liberal lobbyist. You want a conservative, you got a conservative. And they spin like crazy. And it's one of the things I'm trying to discuss with our PR program here. What are we really doing? That's a whole other discussion. But they've certainly gotten very sophisticated about it. And then it turned out they were writing the bill. Now, where's the media in this? The media is out to lunch. And I want to point out one heroic exception was Bill Sapphire of the New York Times, who had been Nixon's speechwriter, and he was a columnist then, a conservative columnist in the New York Times, and I found myself in harmony with Bill Sapphire, who was a privacy nut, believed in privacy. I do too. I once had a privacy program here. And he believed that Too Big to Fail was really dangerous. And he wrote about it, Bill Sapphire. But not so the rest of his paper, not so the rest of the media. Let me just give one little footnote on the media. The media wanted the Telecommunications Act, which we do discuss here. And the Telecommunications Act worked on the same line of modernization. You know, we have to end these onerous restraints and restrictions and so forth to be free to be competitive in the modern world. That was opening the door to absolute disaster. The New York Times, the LA Times is in bankruptcy now precisely because of that. They had the freedom to merge. The LA Times still makes money, but it doesn't matter because they were bought and rebought and everything. Synergy of markets and so forth, and it's a disaster. But the media was all for this modernization. So I'm going to read from the New York Times. First of all, let me just say something, because I said I would say it before about not knowing. This is the way I begin my book. George Bush is in the White House. I got this from Paulson, another Goldman Sachs guy who became Treasury Secretary. And Bush asked Paulson, how did this happen? This is the meltdown. Everything's going to hell up. How did this happen? And Paulson gives a very honest answer. It was a humbling question for someone from the financial sector to be asked. After all, we were the ones responsible. So I put that in as a marker. As you hear a lot of discussion from people like Robert Rubin, who could have anticipated it was a perfect storm. I just want to read from the New York Times, as a paper I grew up respecting and so forth. And this was typical of the mass media coverage of this whole thing. This was an editorial April 8, 1998. So this temporary permission for this merger has taken place. Sandy Weil of Travelers, John Reed of Citicorp, and the New York Times has an editorial. They have announced a $70 billion merger, the biggest in history, that would create the largest financial services company in the world, worth more than $140 billion. It's the biggest of the too big to fail. More than $140 billion. If regulators approve the merger, Citigroup, as the company will be called, will serve about 100 million customers in 100 countries in one stroke. They will have temporarily demolished, get the language, parse the language, the increasingly unnecessary walls built during the Depression to separate commercial banks from investment banks and insurance companies. Okay, that's an editorial. The news report that same day in the New York Times, quote, in a single day, this is a news report. This is the old media we always celebrate. In a single day, with a single bold merger, pending legislation in Congress to sweep away Depression-era restrictions on the financial services industry has been given a sudden and unexpected new chance of passage. Just a week ago, the measure, the 11th attempt in 2 decades to update the nation's banking laws, was written off as dead. But the announcement on Monday of a giant merger of Citicorp and Travelers Group not only altered the financial landscape of banking, it also changed the political landscape in Washington. And then the story goes on to say, indeed, within 24 hours of the deal's announcement, lobbyists for insurers, banks, and Wall Street firms were huddling with Congressional Banking Committee staff members to fine-tune a measure that would update the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act. Not destroy, but update. The 1933 Glass-Steagall Act separating commercial banking from Wall Street insurance to make it more politically acceptable to members members of Congress. Okay, that was the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act that Bill Clinton signed off on. Robert Rubin's urging. Leach, by the way, one of our rivals in ProPublica, much celebrated. Leach is the chairman of the board of that, so we know how deeply they look into banking scandals. Interesting, here was Robert Rubin, Treasury Secretary. I mentioned getting a free drink at Rockefeller and so forth. Robert Rubin pushes through this legislation that makes Citigroup legal, and then he gets a job, $15 million a year for the next decade working in Citigroup. And that's not embarrassing. That is not something commented on very widely. Indeed, Rubin had been written about in Time magazine along with Summers and Kuhnstein in the cover story, Free Who Saved the World. And part of the world that they saved had long-term capital management, which would have gone belly up with 2 Nobel Prize winners deeply involved in it on that watch, predicting exactly what happened. Finally, the last piece of legislation that not often mentioned, but even more onerous, was pushed through by Lawrence Summers, a great academic who was always referred to in the media as brilliant. He's had one sensible idea in his life, other than how to get rich. I don't know what it is, but it's routinely part of the narrative, as well to say, is that these guys are all very smart. And so Summers was made Treasury Secretary, and Summers pushed through the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Again, I can't go into all detail, but Titles 3 and 4 of the Commodity Futures Act couldn't be clearer. And Brooksley Born, who is the hero of this whole piece, I want to talk to into it, that she had been warning about all this, and the old boys club of Summers and Rubin destroyed her. Brooksley Born had said this was really dangerous. She'd been a lawyer for the banks and so forth. And then Summers pushed through, in response to Brooksley Born's concept release, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, again described by the media as a wonderful thing. And I don't think anybody ever bothered to read Titles 3 and 4, which are available on the internet. We have published it on our website, if you can get it. Titles 3 and 4 categorically say that none of these new financial instruments, the collateralized debt, obligations, and credit default swaps, will be subject to any existing legal regulation or regulatory agency. A total blank check. And that's what opened the floodgates to all of these financial gimmicks that have caused so much misery for the world's economy. Summers was the guy who pushed through it. I could read from Summers' testimony, but time does not permit. And then in the great, just to bring the story up to the present, what to my mind is the most appalling thing here is Summers who not only screws up at Harvard. I spoke at Harvard 3 weeks ago, and Kennedy said, well, could he ask me, but how did you become such a debt of iniquity here? What did you teach in the law school, business school, and something that you asked elsewhere too? But I mean, the number of people that have gone through those programs to cause damage to the world is incredible. At any rate, Summers, after a while he's failing at Harvard, still getting $600,000 a year, $578,000 a year in his position, made $8 million a year while he's advising Barack Obama. And his campaign. And he gets $4 million from a D. Shaw hedge fund for being a consultant. And you'll notice the hedge funds have all now the FBI is raiding their offices, but they have not been subject to any new regulation. They've done very well from the bailout. And he got another $4 million from speaking fees. $135,000 for 1.5 hour speech at Goldman Sachs, for example. Similar amount for 2 speeches at Citigroup. And while he's advising Obama, and then Obama does something that a lot of us look the other way. Obama made a decision to reject public finance and take private finance, and lo and behold, we got the largest percentage came from the single economy, came from industry, came from Wall Street. And I would argue that as president, he has made the Bush policies even worse. He has not followed any serious regulation, and in fact followed the policy of just throwing money at the banks and without getting anything in return in the way of mortgage relief or better, really better regulation. So let me end on that. Do I have a few moments?
Yeah, well, let's see if there are questions you'll be able to, sure.
It seems in this narrative that you're giving a pass to Christopher Cox, who I think could have at least demanded an accounting on the credit default swaps and didn't, just completely was asleep at the switch. And indeed Alan Greenspan, who made perhaps the most remarkable statement of the collapse, which was, gee, I never thought that these companies would act against their own economic best interest, thus failing to understand what the collateralized debt obligations had done in terms of ownership for this. And given the nature of policy making in Washington, it strikes me as a little bit of an overclaim to say it's all the Democrats when it was really the Republicans who were pushing for this and in the give and take of government had more at stake and were receiving more money than even the Democrats. If you look at total campaign contributions by party, they benefit much more from banking, finance, insurance than the Democrats do year in and year out.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. You know, there's no, like I said, the song was sung by the Republicans. They supplied the hardcore center of the votes. The Graham Beach Wiley Act was theirs. What happened was that liberals, I mean, if you want to really go into the whole story, liberals in Congress got bought off. The Black Caucus was betrayed. Jesse Jackson came in and testified to Sandy Wiles, supported Justice in Washington. You had guys running Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or old Democratic Party war horses who basically were out for the money now. They stopped being government agencies in any real sense. They were making $15 million a year bonuses in the best of times. Franklin Delano Roosevelt who took over from Johnson. Johnson was the head of the Kennedy Center, the head of the Brookings Institute. My only point is on the Clinton bubble is that the Republicans couldn't pull it off. And that had Clinton not signed up, particularly the last piece of legislation I talked about, Clinton was already a lame duck president. He didn't need to sign that thing in the closing weeks of Congress. And he could have just said, let's let it get to adequate hearings. Let's have the other congressional committees evaluate. It's a great moment for me, Tom, that I'm now being accused of being soft on Republicans. No, really, that was not my goal originally. But my original point, I think, is correct, that Reagan didn't pull it off. Reagan wanted the end of the New Deal regulations. But because of the savings and loan, and that point was very clear, he couldn't pull it off. He couldn't get the votes. He couldn't even get it from people like John McCain, who had been burned by the savings and loan. And so there was a reality there. And as I say, the first President Bush wasn't interested. He didn't think this was a good thing to go look into. And it did remain for Clinton to pick up what really was a dead animal and give it life. The attempt to repeal Glass-Steagall had been going on ever since Glass-Steagall was passed. And if not for Clinton's triangulation, his desire to aggressively reach out and bring over enough Democrats. Now, there were 8 people voted against the reversal of Glass-Steagall. They were all Democrats. One was Russ Feingold, who just lost. You know, and the best statements made against the reversal came from Democrats. There's no question about it. It is also true that George W. Bush was not interested. That's why I read the quote. I mean, it's pretty amazing for a president at the point where his whole economy is collapsing, and the world economy is collapsing, to ask his Secretary of Treasury, how did this happen? And by the way, that's a thing he discusses in his current book. I got that from Paulson, but he unashamedly talks about it. And by the way, in Paulson's book, his memoir, Paulson, who had been head of Goldman Sachs, repeats something that a lot of these CEOs say when they testify. Paulson says that at the time he told Bush that Wall Street was responsible, he did not know that mortgages, credit obligations were at the heart of these suspect packages. He says that in his memoir. Now, Nomi Prince and others say that's just being disingenuous and daring wrong. But it's quite possible, as Michael Parks once told me, when lousy journalism happens, it happens because it's too good to check. You got a juicy story you don't want to check. A lot of this stuff by these CEOs was too good to check. So maybe the guys at AIG didn't really know what was going on in London. And maybe, you know, Blankfein really didn't know. I don't want to let Bush off the hook, but this is a cautionary tale. It's a cautionary tale about the failure of checks and balances. That you would expect the Democrats in Congress to be the check on it. You would expect the media to be the check. And they were out to lunch. The record of the media on this is shameful, absolutely shameful. And I have not heard any real explanation or, you know, how are you going to do it differently?
Well, I was just going to say, the Democrats at that point didn't want to have the albatross of socioeconomic inequality around their neck anymore, particularly the extent to which that socioeconomic inequality corresponded with racially based socioeconomic inequality. And Clinton, a very savvy Arkansas Democrat who knew of such racialized politics, wanted to figure out a third way to get out of that trap and chart a whole new blueprint for Democrats and future generations to follow. And the fact of the matter is, it wasn't a perfect storm, but it was the so-called Goldilocks moment of the Great Moderation, where you had all of these apparent harmonies between monetary policy and fiscal policy that gave a vehicle for them to use cheap credit to placate the poor and placate everyone else as well. And that cheap credit that drove the consumer economy really was what, so we had a role to play, and that we bought that, the media bought that, everyone was happy, there was all this money splashing around, but the reason why it was done, one of the reasons, was because you had this true fault line that Rajan Raghuram calls it, in our body politic of ever richer people and ever poorer, stagnating people, and no solution. And Clinton tried to cobble together one, and it fell apart. But I think that I would like to see more discussion in the media and elsewhere of that lingering time bomb and that lingering problem, which is you've got a two-tier society that looks to be just diverging all the more.
Yeah, it's not lingering, it's a reality. I have a good chapter on these. Because the great claim of the Clinton years is that they somehow helped the middle class. And these were good times, and no luxury. That's just the opposite. Income inequality has been dealt with.
But I guess my point is, home ownership then becomes like the personal.
I understand. And if the mafia had done this, I'm serious. If the mafia done this, they'd be in the chair. And you studied economics, so you know, right?
Yeah, I mean, but I'm also.
So I'll tell you what happened in economics. It concerns corruption of the academic world. Okay? Economics got divorced from political science, from history, from sociology. It happened in the late 50s and the early 60s. And that was okay. You can maybe justify it in some kind of, I thought it's never made sense, but that's what happened. And economics was attempted to become a pure science. Okay, maybe we could even justify that. But in the process of becoming a pure science, it also became very valuable to people trying to sell things and figure out margins and figure out scams. And these mathematical models became incredibly alluring. That's why long-term capital management, like that, these guys who got the Nobel Prize with these formulas that turned out to be an absolute disaster. So the reason I call this a scam, and that was one of the normal problems in the system of race or economic equality, is in particular, it involved these mathematical models. And what happened was that these people came up with a formula of risk management that justified taking the most precious thing in American life to people, their home, their castle, right, their nest egg, and putting it into a security, severing the historic relationship between mortgage and the market. Because up until that was made legal, if the bank gave you a loan, the bank expected to hold it for 30 years, they expected to have the value, they had a responsible interest. That link was broken by this scam. Okay? Now, you're right, the justification was, oh, we're going to make more money available, we're going to make more. But this was a scam that had been percolating right up through the Republicans. It was happening, people were, Brooks Lee Vaughn was alarmed about this. What are you doing? What are these tranches? What are you doing with your risk assessment? That doesn't make any sense. It cannot be regulated. Just give you one example. 65 million American homes now are registered as owned by something called MERS, the Mortgage Electronic Registration System, the computer bank system in Western Virginia. That's why the banks are having trouble collecting. Okay? That's why they've had to have moratoriums that they propose, because somebody comes into court, says, I own the home, you're kicking this guy out, and the guy says, I never met you. I got my mortgage down the street there, and where are you? You're in Western Virginia. And what happened was, again, under Clinton, they severed the time-honored practice going back through English common law, where your mortgage was registered at the county courthouse. You went down there and you said, oh, I see who owns this house. I see who previously owned the house. I see where the payments are made. It's all readily available. You don't have it anymore. Because again, under Clinton, they decided, no, we needed fluidity in the market. Why? Because we needed these security packages to work. All right? And you're quite right. It was done in the name of helping people. And the cynicism was really centered at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. There, the Republicans have a very good argument because they were the gatekeepers. And what people didn't realize about these government-sponsored agencies is they wouldn't know what Roosevelt had in mind when he set up Fannie Mae. They had become traded on the stock market. And these guys, their bonuses were dependent upon the valuation of their stock, just as Citigroup and anyone else was dependent. That was publicly traded. And so these guys brought countrywide Angelo Mazzillo, the guy from up the street here, right, Calabasas, what have you. We have a Truthdig team up there looking for Angelo Mazzillo right now. And here's Angelo Mazzillo, this guy, the biggest culprit of the whole thing. Everybody now acknowledges that. Brought into Fannie Mae by James Johnson, head of the Brookings Institute, head of the Kennedy Institute, you know, Walter Mondale's former chief of staff, great liberal Democrat, enlightened human being, you know, also with a great lobbying organization in every single congressional district. And what do? They come up with the clues system that gives you electronic, you don't have to even talk to a loan officer, they don't have to see whether the house is worth it. It's all about, hey, come in, have a cappuccino, we'll put your numbers in. No, those numbers didn't work. You got some other numbers? Let's change this, we'll change the variable, we'll go into a thing, and that'll work. And they came up with the merge system. This all came out of Countrywide. Angela Mozilla made a merger with Fannie Mae. And that made this legal. I just want to read one thing, since we're in an academic setting. And since Lawrence Summers was the president of Harvard, right? And he's referred to as very bright, and there's certainly, and he's the child, as you know, of economists. Something was Kenneth Arrow.
Yes, he's the nephew of Kenneth Arrow and Paul Sanderson.
Okay.
And both his parents are economists at the Wharton School.
That's why
Yeah.
it's
So,
spelled.
now, to say something really nice about the academic world, Brooksley Bourne, a product of the public schools in San Francisco, public school teachers, went to Stanford. She became a lawyer because there was, in those days, I never checked this out, but I read this in the Stanford alumni paper magazine, so it's true. There was a pink thing and a blue thing. People coming to Stanford. The women took the pink thing, and her interest led her to recommend that she become a nurse. If she had taken the blue one, she probably would have been a doctor, which was her real interest. But anyway, she went to law school. And she was the first woman editor of the Stanford Law Review, and a brilliant lawyer. Went to work for a Washington law firm only because they had a woman law partner. She was active in the Bar Association with Hillary Clinton, fighting on women's issues and so forth. She was one of the people considered for the job that Janet Alito got as Attorney General. She didn't get the consolation prize, but she was made head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And Brooksley Bourne, who had represented banks, had been in court on these collateralized debt applications and credit defaults, knew them cold. The guys didn't know it. Woodman and Summers didn't know it. She wrote a concept release. After studying it, wrote a concept release that this is way before Warren Buffett called them financial instruments of mass destruction. She wrote this concept release and we got to look at this stuff. It's spiraling out of control. It's tens of trillions of dollars in value. Nobody, they're being sold and resold. Nobody was like, just want to read. Because when we think about it, intelligence and brilliance and so forth, we have to wonder, why the best and the brightest keep giving us these wars we can't win, these economies that can't sustain us. So now, she had the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Here he's testifying before the Senate Agricultural Committee, key body on this. And he says, as you know, Mr. Chairman, the CFTC's recent concept release has been a matter of great concern, not merely to Treasury, but to all those with an interest in the over-the-counter derivatives market. In our view, the release has cast a shadow of regulatory uncertainty over an otherwise thriving market, raising risks for the stability and competitiveness of American derivative trading. We believe it is quite important that the doubts be eliminated. That's why they passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Then he goes on to say, first, why there's no uncertainty. First, the parties to these kinds of contracts are largely sophisticated. Think of PR, think of lobbyists. Think of the whole manipulation, the clutter of noise when you try to actually cover a story. Think about that. This is what these people were saying. First, the parties to these kinds of contracts are largely sophisticated financial institutions that would appear to be eminently capable of protecting themselves from fraud and counterparty insolvencies, and most of which are already subject to basic safety and soundness regulation under existing banking and security laws. The very laws that he wiped out, okay? Second, given the nature of the underlying assets involved, namely supplies of financial exchange and other financial instruments, there would seem to be little scope for market manipulation of the kind seen in traditional agricultural commodities. I wish we had the stability of what of traditional. So here's a guy smashing. Brooksley Bourne doesn't get reappointed. She's not listened to, and they passed a piece of legislation that says none of this stuff will be regulated. There's no adult supervision. Okay, this is not about economics. It's about politics. It's about money. It's about manipulation. That's the reality. This has nothing to do with the workings of the market. This has to do with unfettered greed and corruption. And I would argue that the corruption of the academic profession runs through our university worlds, where you get the grants, where you get the money, what you focus on. It's why is Summers picked for that job, because he had all those great times with us. Why was Robert Rubin made the head of their advisory board a part of it, you know, because he has all those great ties. And what do they focus on? They don't focus on inconvenient truths, you know? It's very interesting. Al Gore has a movie made, Inconvenient Truths. The inconvenient truth of Al Gore's tenure, let me take it to you on the Democrats. The inconvenient truth of Al Gore said, why did he sit there when the Clinton administration was doing all this bad stuff? You know? They didn't take that much courage to come out against global warming. It took a lot of courage to stand against Wall Street during those years, and he doesn't do it.
How do you account for the lack of public outrage?
Because we're raised in a society, and this is a communications issue, we're raised in a society in which we are made the victims. And we blame the victims. It's our fault. I've had students in our class raise their hand and talk to them, and they say, my father lost his house. You were there when that happened, right? A true story.
True story.
My father lost his house. We're worried. I don't know if I can stay in school. You know, it's his fault. He should have read the fine print. He was deceived. He got out of control. And so we live in a culture in which, you know, you screwed up. Now, my God, today I signed on for yet another thing from Google, and I didn't read the fine print. Okay, I agreed, right? Because I was looking for Google Books. I agreed, and I signed, and I even gave a credit card. I agreed. Okay? It's not because I'm a fool. It's because I assume that a company like Google is being regulated to some degree. There are courts out there. There'll be class action suits. There are regulatory agencies. And so I can trust the fine print. And that came to be true of buying a house. You were handed, I remember when the last thing I got, they were printing it out over a printer, you know, in some other office. You'll get it in 4 days, you know, and everybody, why? Because you trusted the process. You trusted the process because there were rules of the road, okay? The public still buys into blaming themselves. That's what we do in this country. Until they find the scapegoat. That's what the Tea Party does. They come along and say, no, it's not really your fault. Your life is miserable. Your kids can't go to school. You don't have a retirement anymore. The pain is incredible. You go to Riverside in southern Florida, it's unbelievable. The whole state of Arizona. But what do you do? Oh, it's not, you know, no, it's not your fault. It's the immigrants. Right? That's what let it be gays. You know, women got on with it. We don't, you know, the schools are too permissive. Right? This is sort of the package of the Tea Party. With which, the exception of the libertarians, the principal libertarians, who are not in the majority, I'm in trouble with some of my liberal friends for having kind things to say about Rand Paul and Ron Paul. But in the main, the Tea Party is the same old crap of manipulating and deceiving people, and how deep the scapegoats. And the scapegoats will be everywhere except people who created this problem.
I learned a lot from all the comment and especially what he said, and real quickly, I want to appreciate you spending decades trying to bring out transparency for all of us. And it's a lot of effort and a lot of risk taking on your part too, and I appreciate that from my heart. And my question, my really quick,
it's a lot of fun.
And then my question is, the creature from Jekyll Island was out for a long time when they started the Federal Reserve, how they created the Federal Reserve, J.P. Morgan, Tesla, and all these people back in Tesla's time. They can agree with it. So they met and created this creature called Federal Reserve, printing money and charging interest to a private bank. So the material's been out for decades. And the Bilderberg meeting, last one in Spain, was out for decades. And Peter Jennings was not allowed, he was invited, he was not allowed to print out what's the agenda.
Well,
so my question is, if we push it, there's a balance about pushing it. So then we don't trigger Homeland Security, chipping people, and then vaccine, and then we prepare ourselves.
I get this question quite a bit.
So the balance, how do we prepare our student here that has a lot of long student? My question is, my daughter wants to go to journalism. So I say, honey, if we go to USC with the loan you get from journalism, what kind of job is the school preparing a student at 21-year-old, not having the right tool about what's going on, and have a job that pays $20,000 a year? And so I appreciate what you're doing. What are we giving the tool? What kind of tool are we giving the student?
That's what we're hearing. But let me just say something. You know, how many people? It's a dwindling group, and I guess we're going to wrap it up. But let me just ask you a question. Did anyone in this room really follow the release of documents by the Federal Reserve last week? You followed a little bit. It's amazing to me because thanks to Barney Sanders, a Democratic Socialist senator, and Ron Paul, a principal libertarian, who have been pushing this for years, they got an accounting, a limited accounting. In fact, Ron Paul accused Barney Sanders of selling out because the last minute the Obama administration pushed down on, no, we can't reveal everything. But let's get the details of what happened in basically the bank transfer. And in the bank transfer, in the money, everybody focuses on the TARP stuff, which is really chump change compared to what really happened. We're talking about at least $3.4 trillion stuff, with all sorts of other guarantees and everything. Well, finally, this was released. And on the show that I do, both the center and the right-wing guy took the position all along it shouldn't be released. The Fed has to have secrecy, has to operate in this way and so forth and so on. I never understood that argument at all. But big decisions, the biggest decisions about how to deal with the Fed were not made by Congress. They were made at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at the Fed, the meeting to save AIG, they went on into the evening, the blank fund shows up and blah, blah, blah. These meetings are going on there. And so now we have this data. The data is fascinating. Why did we give $78 million to a Swiss bank called UBS, where Phil Graham, who's the guy who gave us this legislation, now works. Why did all this money flow out in this way? Why were J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs allowed access to those windows when they weren't supposed to be? And how did this all happen? And so the release from the Feds, as you know, it's dull, deliberately designed to be dull, right? Fortunately, the Wall Street Journal, and I have to say this in an all-media point, I haven't seen any deterioration in the Wall Street Journal news reporting. And the Wall Street Journal did a bang-up job with about 5 stories on what's in that data. Now, there's been some good reporting. And it's devastating. But it doesn't arouse our general interest. Why? Because basically we bought the idea, okay, this is the way it works. There was going to be this Great Depression. And first of all, why was there going to be a Great Depression? If you guys are so smart about this, why did you take all these risks in the first place? Right? I mean, why did you bring us to the point where we're facing a Great Depression? Secondly, why was it okay to let Lehman Brothers go down? I mean, all this stuff, and why did it have to be done this way? Why, if I lose my house, you can resell it, you can do things. We have with the FDIC a lot of procedures for saving banks that go belly up, or for turning them around, or finding new owners, and so forth. So the Great Depression scenario, which is the one that grips people all the time, and they hadn't done that. They didn't give them the store, or we'd all be in really, really bad shape. I don't buy it, but that's basically the line that they put out, and we need secrecy. Let me just say something else about class that has come up a little bit since we're a small group. This doesn't hit everybody the same way, okay? If you've got a tenured faculty position, to start close to home, or you're a high-paid civil servant, I live downtown, I see the restaurants are still full. If you're working, maybe you have a furlough, maybe some things have been cut, but you're doing well. If you're in Washington, you're doing well. If you're on Wall Street, you're doing well. So this is what is meant by a class-divided society. And the rest of the people are left hanging out there. Who do I blame? I screwed up. I should have taken this course in college. I should have gone ISD. I should have gone USC. What did I do wrong? And so forth. And I think that, I'll end with the way I began, this piece by Chris Hedges, it's really a brilliant analysis of the problem that we have right now politically. Because we don't have a sensible answer to people who are hurting. That's the suffering he's trying to address in this piece. He's saying we're just ignoring the pain out there. And that this is, first of all, this thing is not anywhere close to being solved. Housing is in really deep trouble. The unemployment just ticked up even more. It's not going away. And every time it looks like it might get better, they'll dump more of these mortgages on and destroy housing because they're going to get rid of them. And no one's got a real good answer.
The student default, the student loan default could be going to be $750 trillion.
Right, then commercial. Okay, last one or
I think we're,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for the